The links between menstruation and sexual harassment and sexual violence for me came through learning about disaster displacement camps. I was investigating those partly because I was looking at the links between gender-based violence and climate change. So I wanted to know if gender-based violence can actually be a cause of climate change. While I was doing research on that, I was looking at a lot of reports from disaster displacement camps and conflict displacement camps, refugee centers, where the constant concern for women was one of two things, not one of two things, it was both things: menstrual hygiene management and physical safety. And these two things always went hand in hand, and they're really, really consistent over the course of 20 years of reports at this point. So for me, that's how these things came together. I'm also very interested in future cities. That's kind of a buzzword in the world of startups and technology and architecture. I'm interested in figuring out how we can integrate our app into future city design, because a lot of the talk around future cities right now is how to create safe spaces for women and girls. A lot of that approach is preventative and protective, but it's kind of overlooking the fact that no matter how preventative and protective things are, things happen in the moment. Self-defense empowers us to disrupt things from happening in the moment, as opposed to seeking aid afterwards, which is also important, but you still feel helpless in the moment.
Yeah.
So bringing these two things together and looking at it from a more global view, I also realized that because of climate change, and as climate change kind of speeds up, an extremely large portion of the world will be passing through disaster displacement camps over the next 10, 20, 50 years. And these are our future cities. So future cities aren't utopias that, I mean, hopefully they are utopias, but they're not yet to be designed. They're already being created, and they're already growing and evolving into what we will all be living in. And that sounds frightening, and I don't mean it to sound frightening, but I do mean it to sound more realistic.
When you started digging deeper into the research, were there certain situations or case studies or points that really surprised you that people are not taking action on it? Stakeholders are not prepared for these refugee centers or shelters, especially when it comes to menstruators. What were those key points where you were like, okay, we need to rethink how we are, designing these facilities?
The things that came clear to me were the lack of menstrual hygiene management products, whether that's pads or tampons or just cloths to wash yourself or changes of underwear. They're there. People are given what are called dignity kits. Those aren't always provided with a realistic amount of menstrual pads. They're also usually provided with a whistle and a flashlight. So one of the most consistent complaints are that women and girls have to travel from their living shelter to a community latrine or community shower. That journey is very dangerous. Sharing that space publicly, even with other women, can cause a lot of shame. A lot of women and girls, of course, already feel shame around their menstruation, which is what we're talking about all day today. And when we're feeling shame, especially about anything with our bodies, that's when we're most vulnerable.
Yeah.
When we're feeling shame and we're using facilities in a center at night, which is definitely more dangerous. When we're using facilities, or we're sort of using open fields as opposed to facilities because we want to hide the fact that we're menstruating. The last thing we want to do is blow a whistle, which is really, is really, really noisy. And that's the point. But that's also, that's kind of a self-defense panacea that has actually gone out of fashion in the world of self-defense in general. That's something that was told to women and girls in the 70s and 80s, at least in the United States and in European countries. And it's nobody believes that this is a useful thing anymore. I'm also kind of really curious about the fact that women and girls are asked to carry a whistle and a flashlight and menstrual pads and cloths. There's a lot of things to carry on your way to the communal latrine. So that was one of the main things. But another thing that I think is really overlooked is also domestic violence, violence within families. One of the things that really shocked me, shocking is not maybe the word I want to use, but surprised me because I hadn't thought of it this way, was that women are often punished for cutting pieces of blanket and cloth to use to absorb menstrual flow. In 2013, in the Za'atari refugee camp, before it became like the giant city that it is today, when people were actually still living in tents, there were freezing floods followed by blizzards. There was no facilities for winter care. So suddenly there was a brand new crisis on top of a crisis that already existed, where people needed winter coats and blankets and heaters and all kinds of stuff. And at the same time, you also still need something to absorb menstrual blood. So if you are cutting a piece of a blanket, which now the value of this blanket has suddenly increased 1,000-fold, and you're cutting a piece of this blanket to absorb menstrual blood because you have to, that, of course, escalates the likelihood of domestic violence by, in some estimations, is 300%.
Frightening to hear. There's another case study that I was reading from Kenya where girls, because they don't have access to period products, they have no choice but to exchange what they call sex favors, or which for me is sexual harassment, taking advantage of somebody who's in a situation where they can't afford period products. And for that, there's a lot of advocacy that's happening. Are there other cases beyond Kenya where women are forced into sexual labor just so they can manage their a normal process that they go through?
Yes, there was a study done for a center that was created in Bangladesh after some flash floods, I think in 2008, where the same issues existed. Women were forced into either sexual labor or financial bribes, actually from the care workers who were distributing supplies. Supplies were often short or non-existent, or people were demanding sexual favors or financial favors. In Uganda, women will exchange or sell their food. So in camps in Uganda where food is provided for people, they'll often sell their food in exchange or just to get the money to buy period products. So it's pretty global.
Yeah. This makes you realize that it's such a grave issue, and it's still, this link has not been explored at all. There's another aspect that one of the doctors was speaking about, that girls that get bullied so much in the classroom, and especially if it's boys and girls in that classroom. Boys don't know about the process. They end up shaming the girls so much that they would commit suicide. So I even feel that the bullying is another form of harassment that girls are facing at that time, and they're not ready at that time to really handle this the way that they should be able to do it, because the resources are not there. So my question to you now is, what would you propose to the stakeholders, the UN agencies, the local NGOs, the governments, and civil society organizations, youth activists? What can we do right now to change the situation? How can we make them more inclusive? How can we make it healthy for communities that are already dealing with so much? They're dealing with disasters, they are displaced. How can we make this a smoother process, a healthier process for them?
The UNHRC, the High Commission for Humanitarian Crises, has a guide. It uses something called the Sphere Project, which is or the Sphere Handbook, which is its guide for erecting displacement camps. That guide, as well as their camp management toolbook, addresses things like gender-based violence and menstrual hygiene, and they use specific measurements. Latrines should be no more than 50 meters away, et cetera, et cetera. Lighting should be prioritized for bathing in latrines for girls and women. those handbooks are 500 pages. So in a crisis situation, those handbooks go right out the window. And I think there's some people who have been participating today who have actually been in those situations, having to create emergency housing. When emergency housing is being created, emergency shelters are being created, it tends to take a top-down approach, which is kind of the only way you can really do it. You know, you're trying to make sure that a large number of people are getting basic needs met: security, shelter, sanitation, water, and food. That doesn't really make sense to change that, because these are the basic needs of humans, especially in crisis situations. But I think if we shifted our focus to prioritizing those needs for women and girls and designing those things for women and girls' hygiene and safety, then everyone actually benefits. Because if they're the most vulnerable groups, then just by default, everyone else benefits from that. So I think creating blueprints that are easily deployed for disaster displacement camps that have to be erected very quickly is one way to address that. The other way to address that is, of course, teaching girls and women body literacy, which is about menstruation, of course, how it works, what's happening in your body, why it's important to wash, why it's important to change pads when we can. It's very difficult to go against customs and cultures and religious beliefs around shame, or around menstrual shame specifically. But at the same time, I think that we can also, what's the word I'm looking for? We can also kind of help people understand that not everybody sees what we think they see, which is a really big part of shame, isn't it? You know, a lot of girls and women believe that when we're menstruating, we produce an odor, which we do. But at the same time, our olfactory nerves become more acute during that time. We actually have more olfactory senses than men. So we do produce an odor and we can smell it, but we assume that everyone else can as well. And that's not necessarily true. Of course, it's true if we're not able to wash and practice good hygiene or ideal hygiene. I also think negotiation tools are really important. You know, we both talked about how women are selling food to buy menstrual products, are exchanging sexual favors for menstrual products. Women are often find themselves as heads of household. That can also be difficult, especially in a displacement center, because if you're head of household, who's going to watch your children while you go someplace else to deal with your menstrual needs? So you need to negotiate that as well. So negotiation tools, I think, are also really, really important to learn. And I believe that self-defense, basic self-defense, is a useful thing to learn. Self-defense doesn't necessarily mean becoming bulky and manly. It simply means understanding how your body already works, the things you're already doing that are self-defense oriented, and then how to sort of shift that focus and reapply those things to situations to help you make space so that you can do whatever it is you need to do, whether it's in a camp, on the street, at work, whatever it is. When we learn to trust our bodies and we have empowerment that way, starting sort of with the self, with education, with full body literacy, that gives us dignity. And that helps us redefine space. And that helps us also reduce risks of trauma, whether it's period trauma or physical trauma. And it helps us sort of be able to go on with the next thing that we need to do in our lives, whether it's displacement or work or education or whatever it is. So I think it also helps teach us our resilience. There's a very famous study about women's resilience in flood situations in northern India and northern Pakistan, I think. It's really focused on how resilient women are. And I think a lot of times people overlook that fact because it gets turned into simply, women's labor, women's work, and it gets very dismissed. But I think when we have full body literacy and we learn how resilient we are, that adds to confidence and also helps us reduce trauma.
I also just wanted to end on the note that you're based out of Berlin and there's a huge refugee community there. You've had the chance to actually work with a lot of people. Would you like to kind of share that teaching them self-defense or starting on that journey with them? How was that experience? Because if we can start there, we can also kind of educate them on menstruation as well. So wanted to know your point of view on your experience with them.
Sure. And I'd like to say hello to my friend Federica, who's here from another menstrual health initiative here in Berlin called Hilda's House, and we're working with refugee communities as well. Working with women in these communities, especially around self-defense, has been a fascinating experience because, as Shavana says in the note here, sometimes people relate self-defense to learning fighting behaviors. But what we've learned instead is basically just how to make space. It also helps a lot of women to understand, not to understand, but to acknowledge, again, their own resilience. So often women are quite resistant when we first begin our courses because they think like, I don't really want to learn how to punch or kick. But what we are learning is how we can use the clothing that we already have in our favor, how to move our bodies in ways that are not overtly aggressive but are still very effective, how to protect ourselves by covering our movements so that we reduce the risk of punishment, because oftentimes men are socialized to take their anger out on women or to punish women who set boundaries for themselves. So there's this wonderful community center in the Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh that was created for women that provides a safe space for bathing and toiletries, as well as therapy for sexual assault and menstrual education and all kinds of things. And the way that it was designed from the outside is meant to look sort of very shaggy and part of the environment, and that was done for two reasons. One, because apparently there's quite a lot of elephant attacks in that area, so they wanted to not draw the attention of elephants. But two, because they also didn't want to draw the attention of people from the local community who may enter these areas and hurt women and girls. So they wanted from the outside for it to just look like something nobody would want to enter, which is a really interesting form of self-defense, because that's the way that we also approach it, especially with refugee communities. Simply because people are coming from places where it's a different culture, they have different sets of priorities. That's totally fine by me. We're not asking anyone to change. That's not my goal. And I don't think it's theirs either. You know, people have been through so much. It's like, I don't want to have to go through one more thing. But it is a matter of, you know, you don't have to go through one more thing, but here are some tools you can use so that you can navigate the new city. So you don't have to worry about the racism and bigotry that you may be confronted with. You may be confronted with it, but here are some tools to handle it. Here are some tools to disrupt, as well as in centers where there is sexual harassment and there is sexual violence. You know, how to disrupt those in that moment. So it's been really successful. The women have really, really enjoyed it. It's also a great chance for all of us to practice our German.
Yeah, awesome. I'm just going to ask if Federica wants to share her comments as well. We're very happy to have you join us if you want to share something, and especially because it's Menstrual Hygiene Day, we'd love to hear from you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Susie, for the invite. And yeah, nice to meet all of you. Yeah, we know with Hilda's House, we focus on physical and psychological empowerment. The ultimate goal is that women in vulnerable positions reach financial independence. And in order to do that, the first goal is to actually provide the tools to overcome physical and psychological barriers. For that, like, we really think that it's really important to combine like mental health, which would be like with art therapy, trauma yoga, but also self-defense that gives strength. That's why we also have like a collaboration that is about to start with Pretty Deadly and Susie, starting from June, with a community of 30 women in a refugee status. And combined with that, we will also do we will also start a menstrual hygiene program with this community, because we really believe at Hilta's house, and I know with Pretty Deadly, that the two has to go together. Mental health with a physical and psychological empowerment, they have to go together. This is really, really important. And then when the women will have the tools to properly feel included in the society, because we don't talk about integration, we talk about inclusion, which is really, really important. There will be step-by-step transition to a next phase of this inclusion process, and maybe start an income generating program and so on. Actually, at Hilta's house, and this is something I will have talk with Susie when we'll talk over the phone in our appointment, we're about to start a program with Abad. Abad is an organization, they work with for gender equality based in Beirut. And we will start this connection between Abad and Hilta's house. And we will work with the refugee camp, the Palestinian and the Syrian one. And the idea starting from August, there will be a pilot phase to see how it goes. And then we'll see from the next season, I will say for end of 2021. And the idea is to produce a menstrual product, a reusable menstrual product, also here in Berlin with the women of our community, I'm talking about women in refugee status or seeking asylum, and they will help us. We will pay for them, for the service, and they will support us in producing this menstrual part. And one part will be distributed in a refugee camp here in Berlin, and another part will be distributed there in Lebanon. And why that? Because I think studies show that people in a refugee condition, they sometimes feel useless. They feel like they don't belong to anywhere anymore. And so in this way, we can actually help them to make, hey, we need your help. We need to produce this for the community there and here. And also we will purchase from a social enterprise there for the seed phase. We will purchase from Days for Girls or a smaller social enterprise, and then we will see. So I really believe this connection between physical empowerment and mental strength to go together with self-defense and menstrual hygiene. That's a little bit my point of view.
This is amazing, because the theme for tonight or today is partnerships, and you guys are doing already so much work in terms of partnerships, women, based communities coming together and working on this topic. So I'm really, really grateful for both of you, Susie and Federica, for joining. And now I will have to conclude it and move on to our next panel.